If you've played all three of Team Ico's games, I probably had a very similar experience to you. I played Shadow of the Colossus and fell in love with the mysterious world, story, and sparse mechanics. Then I went back and played Ico. The world was so similarly lacking in answers that I loved it just as much. And there were even less mechanics in Ico, almost like a minimalist type of game design. And then, after Ico, I waited. And I waited. And waited. I remember taking the bus to my local GameStop. It was a couple of weeks before Christmas, which, back then 8 years ago, wasn't the most common time for a game to come out. I remember sitting on that metal bus stop, cold as hell, holding my copy of the game in my hands with a big smile on my face. I really couldn't believe it. Work on The Last Guardian started all the way back in 2007, and 9 years later, I finally had the game in my hands. There were so many rumors. IGN even announced that the game had been cancelled, which wasn't true. The director of the game, Fumito Ueda, left Sony 4 years into development and started his own company, Gen Design. But Ueda was still under contract, and his company helped them finish the game. There was never a clear answer on what happened during development or what was causing so many issues, but the simplest answer to me points to two things. Much like with Ico, The Last Guardian is essentially a giant escort mission, with the player having to guide and rely on an AI companion to get through the game. But unlike Ico, and unlike most games with a similar premise, the AI companion isn't human, and we have to remember, this game started development on the PS3 in 2007. It took 6 more years for us to get The Last of Us. The reason I mention that is because it too is a game surrounding a player and their AI companion. But even then, in 2013, Ellie's AI still wasn't that good. I remember back in the day people talking about how she would just run past an enemy or stumble around during stealthy, tense moments, breaking their immersion. And maybe I'm crazy for saying this, but I feel like programming a reliable and realistic animal AI companion is way harder than programming a human one. Fumito Ueda has stated that he and his team put much emphasis on Trico behaving as realistically like an animal as possible. Most animals behave extremely unpredictable. Most times our pets are relaxed, but sometimes they just flip out or react to things that we don't see. It can be really funny, but I can also imagine that being very difficult to program. I think Team Ico tried putting some of that unpredictable nature into Trico's AI. I even found a quote saying part of Trico's design was deliberately unbalanced because looking strange was important here. Deliberately unbalanced. And we have to remember that the development of the game jumped from PS3 to PS4. I don't know much about the technical side of game development, but I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that switching what console you're programming for mid-game isn't easy. Unfortunately, I think when The Last Guardian was finally released, there were probably many people at Sony breathing a sigh of relief. This game was the beginning of a turning point for Sony. Ever since the tail end of the PlayStation 4, they started focusing on shinier, more realistic graphics, more serious and gritty storytelling, and more violence. I have an old video about this very topic, link in the description. I had 2 weeks off of work, and for some reason this game entered my mind. It's been 8 years since I last played it. I haven't played it since it came out. I wanted to ask myself, where would I rank this game in the Team Ico trilogy? Nothing really speaks to my soul the same way these games do. So I decided to jump back in. Immediately I was pulled back into the wondrous and crumbling world of Team Ico and Fumito Ueda. The ancient, dusty architecture falling apart as moss and vines sprout from everywhere. The sunlight which forces itself into buildings through cracks in the ceiling. The sky is just so white that you almost wonder if it's even there. You almost wonder where those birds you keep hearing chirp away are. There's this overwhelming sense that you're on your own and you'll never get many answers. I love all of these trademarks of a Team Ico game. Much like with Ico, this game is essentially one big Zelda dungeon. You're going to be pushing blocks, climbing up mossy walls, lighting torches, and evading enemies, all the while having to cooperate with your giant buddy Trico. Remember how I brought up the realistic animal movements of Trico? Even in the very first room of the game, I felt myself staring at him, watching his movements and trying to figure out what he was thinking, what he was going to do. Within the first few minutes, there was this time that I tossed him a barrel, which he likes to eat, and he looked at me with caution and anger, almost like he didn't trust me to watch him eat. So I turned around and walked a few steps away, and he immediately began munching. I love that the game didn't tell me to do this. There was no text box, there was no hint, nothing telling me that Trico doesn't want to be watched while he's eating. It was just this reaction I had based on my feelings, based on the way he looked. He didn't trust me at first, and when you hear what he's been through, I can't really blame him. I got these emotions while playing the game that I truly don't think I've felt in the 8 years since I first played it. It was a mixture of curiosity and frustration, but, and I mean this in the realest way possible, it was a good type of frustration. Like when you tell your dog to sit or to do a trick and they just won't do it. It feels very true to life. I haven't had a dog in almost a decade, but this game reminded me of how it felt. There were many times while playing I found myself smiling because Trico likes to just wander around, observing the things around him. You'll find him sniffing little cracks in the walls or rolling around in a puddle of water. Sometimes you two will be exploring totally separate rooms, and after a minute or two of not seeing him, he'll randomly catch up to you. He wants to be around you, and in turn, you want to be around him. You want to pet him, to rub the blood out of his feathers, to rip the spears out of him. This one time, after feeding him a barrel, he started making this really cute noise and rubbing his nose against me. And it doesn't start this way. For the first hour of the game, I got the impression that Trico was only following me to see if I could help him escape his imprisonment. And before anybody asks why he just doesn't fly away, it's because he's recently been injured before the opening of the game and his wings don't work. So you go from being two strangers who can't even talk to each other to best friends, to moments like this. This is all with little to no cutscenes, which is a Team Ico trademark. 99% of games let the cutscenes do the character development. But it's little interactions like this that the game gives the player stories within the gameplay, which are the best stories for video games. You might think I'm crazy, but it's moments like this that the game was worth the $60 I spent on it. Or moments like this. If this was any other game, again, this would be a cutscene. The game would stop the player and let the camera pan around the room, and the boy would say something like, "What is this? Wow, it's so cold in here." But instead, The Last Guardian lets the player just have this experience. We can tell that something is weird about this room by the foreign architecture that doesn't match anything else we'll see for a majority of the game. We can tell that our character is cold not because the game is vocalizing it, but because of how the boy reacts. It feels like Team Ico, with all three of their games, but especially The Last Guardian, trusts the player to let their feelings control their experience instead of the game telling you how to feel. This game just lets us feel whatever comes natural to us. This also goes for the gameplay. The Last Guardian explains to the players new rules of the game without stopping them. There's this part early on where you come across this stained glass and Trico just stops and keeps staring at it, almost like he's hypnotized. He can't do anything else and he won't listen to you if you try to command him. And obviously, you need Trico to escape the fortress, so your only option is to toss the glass over a cliff and shatter it, thus freeing him from his trance. This type of scenario and this stained glass will come up multiple times in the future with more and more complexity. Without stopping the player, the game explains a mechanic with the one thing only video games can do: interactivity. And if that isn't enough for you, there are plenty of quiet times where you are just left to relax in some of the most tranquil locations I've ever seen in a video game. This is just the type of game that makes me stop moving and stare at everything around me. It's like a digital museum, and there are exhibits constantly surrounding me. I like castles in general as a setting, but something about abandoned castles just hits way harder. This ornate architecture meant to host royalty and hundreds of people, just seemingly left to time. There's a contradiction within these two Team Ico games. Most games try to get the player to feel like they exist in their world. These two games make it clear that your goal is not to exist here, but to escape from here. And yet, it's these heavenly garden type areas that would make me, if I was the boy, stop and revel in their natural beauty. I almost get a feeling of, what's the rush? But you have to go home. You have to get out of here. I barely hear anybody talk about this game, so I honestly feel so alone when I say that this scenery is more beautiful than 90% of games I've seen. The most recent example I can remember of being blown away by a game's scenic beauty is when you're walking through those red or golden forests in Ghost of Tsushima. And I'm not talking about the pure graphical beauty, I'm just talking about the landscapes we travel through, the enormous, impossible structures, such as these giant wind chimes with the stained glass ornaments, make me pause and just wonder how the team came up with this. And why don't I see anything even close to this in other games? Whenever I look at the boy, I see a small touch of Studio Ghibli influence. It's the first and only game of theirs to have this little bit of cartooniness to it, and the influences I feel don't stop there. To stay with Ghibli, the architecture reminds me of Castle in the Sky, and the boy's growing relationship with Trico rings of the Iron Giant to me, a childhood favorite. Part of me really can imagine this game as a children's animated film, but since the game doesn't really have any characters or a plot until much later, it feels like this can only exist as a game. Going back to Trico, one thing that I found really clever is how we are occasionally reminded that Trico isn't this cute little dog or cat. He's not a house pet. He's a wild, ferocious animal, and you can see his rage when he devastates the suits of armor that chase you. His roars sound like he could take on most of the Colossi in Shadow of the Colossus. He probably could actually, at least half of them. He gets so angry when he has to fight enemies that the only way to calm him down is if you climb on top of him and pet him. You need to soothe him to bring him back to reality because he's so used to just fighting and being wild and angry. And once you do calm him down and that light in his eyes fades away, he's back to being your best friend. This one little moment in the dark made me smile so much because if you saw this in any other video game, you would shit your pants. But in The Last Guardian, you feel safe. If you're the type of person who loves the way video games make you feel, or maybe you're just an animal person, a big dog or cat person, I really do recommend playing this game just for the feelings. I caught myself making faces like this a lot, or thinking to myself, come on boy, come on little guy. Even though Trico is much larger than the boy, This game honestly made me think if I should get a pet someday soon, because I haven't had one in forever and I honestly forgot how cute of a feeling it can be to look after an animal. Animals and humans have worked together for thousands of years, but it's a give and take relationship. In most games, the animals just give and we take. Epona and Ocarina of Time will come to you whenever you want and do exactly what you want, because it's a video game and we want function to always be the first priority. But Trico is the only animal companion in a game that doesn't always give. Sometimes he will take. Like there are certain points where he just lays down and will not move unless you find him some more barrels to eat. I love it so much. Shadow of the Colossus by far has the most music in any Team Ico game because you need music to accompany the fights and the dramatic moments. Ico is an extremely quiet game, but I think The Last Guardian might come in second when it comes to quantity of music. Don't get me wrong, most of this game is very silent. You will only be hearing the boys' footsteps and the hum of these empty hallways. But there are many moments where this whimsical, almost triumphant music comes in, again feeling like a children's animated film, and it really works. I have to be fair though, and get into the aspects of the game which can be frustrating. In the normal way, the bad way. It feels like maybe the first half of the game was play tested a lot because I had zero problems with Trico's AI. He did everything I wanted during puzzles. He attacked enemies, he jumped, he shot lightning in the exact areas I wanted. But it was around the 60% or 3/4 mark that my buddy started to annoy me a little bit. There's this one part where you gotta get him to swim underwater, and he just wouldn't react the right way for 7 to 8 minutes. The game tells you that if you hold R1, you can give him a command like where to go. Then it tells you that if you hold R1 and push the jump button, triangle, you can make him jump. So since the dive button is X, I also tried holding R1 and pressing X to make Trico dive underwater, but that didn't work either. I'm wondering if somehow during development, the back half of the game just didn't have enough time to be polished, because it feels like Trico is guessing a little bit more. I'm gonna be honest, this game requires a level of patience similar to Shadow of the Colossus, because in that game, there are certain bosses that don't always react the way you want them to, and it can be super frustrating. Number 4 and 15 are the ones that come to mind. Most people will have the patience for Shadow of the Colossus because the concept of fighting giant monsters is super freaking cool. But in a game like Ico or The Last Guardian, where the main focus is just puzzles, I can understand people getting pissed off. The only other nitpicks I have other than Trico's AI in the second half of the game is I think the boy is a little too fast. And he has like a little bit of a ragdoll thing going on, which can add a real sense of weight to him. Like if you push against a wall, he will most likely fall on his back. But this also means sometimes you'll bump into shit and trip because he's so fast and the hallways are so tight. Speaking of tight hallways, I know the contrasting size of Trico and the boy is a large appeal of the game's visuals, but I think Trico could have been shrunk down just a tiny bit. Because sometimes when you're in a cramped area with him, the game is trying to figure out if the camera should focus on the boy or Trico, and it can be pretty tough to see. In Shadow of the Colossus, if you wanted to hang on to a Colossi, you would have to hold R1, and there was a stamina meter. In this game, it makes a lot of sense to not have a stamina meter, but I think they should have kept the hold R1 to grip mechanic, because there is a bit of jankiness if you're trying to climb on, climb, jump off of Trico multiple times in succession. Lastly, these dumb button prompts never go away, which is kind of annoying. But that's really it though. Those are my only criticisms. Remember how I said I had 2 weeks of vacation? I beat this game in 2 days. That's how addicted I was to the environments and emotions provided to me. The Last Guardian is something I wish more games were. Memorable and truly special. I've played a lot of games in the last 8 years, and I can't think of one I played that's quite like The Last Guardian. In that, it is its own experience. And if you'll allow me to use a metaphor that a first grader would come up with, I find that most games today are different shades of the same color, different flavors of the same gameplay formula. They elicit the same feelings from me as a player because they ask of me the same things. The Last Guardian somehow takes aspects from both of its predecessors and creates an entirely new thing, a new color. If you wanted to counter that argument, you could say that this game is pretty much Eco 2 for the many reasons I brought up earlier, and that would be fair. But in Eco, you are the one doing the protecting. There is combat. In The Last Guardian, you're the one who needs protecting. There isn't combat. In Eco, your companion, Yorda, doesn't have much of a mind of her own, no offense. The only thing she can really do is open up special gates. In The Last Guardian, if you're not using Trico, he'll start to act of his own free will, sometimes even giving hints to the player without ever saying a word. He is just as alive as the boy. There is a completely different dynamic between the player and their companion, which really changes the experience. I'm sure a lot of you will look at the title of this video and think I'm just trying to be a contrarian, just trying to be different. Sony's put out a lot of good games over the last few years. Ghost of Tsushima, Horizon Forbidden West, The Last of Us Part 2. Those games are highly polished gameplay formulas we've seen for years prior to their release. We should still praise those games for their polish and their good game feel. But for me, whenever I played them, it was a been here done that type of deal. For The Last Guardian, maybe I can say been here because the world is so similar to their other two games. But I can confidently say, I haven't done that. I haven't had to do what this game asks me to do in any other game, and I really appreciate that. The word masterpiece has sadly been overused and abused in the last decade. When I play a game, I ask myself certain questions. Number 1, what do I feel like the developers were trying to do with this game? Number 2, do I feel like it succeeds in conveying that? Number 3, am I enjoying using the mechanics? Number 4, does the game respect my time by pacing itself well? Number 5, is this game unique in any meaningful way to me? What I don't ask myself when I play a game is this game perfect? Because if we're being brutally honest, almost nothing is perfect. Art is about translating something in your heart and mind into reality, and trying to translate it perfectly is almost an impossible task, but it's the attempt that's the beauty. The attempt is the art. When I look at Sony's output over the last 8 years, despite actually loving some of those games, this is the last game I can feel confident in answering those questions. And it's unbelievable to me how in less than a decade, Sony has become a company that I don't think would greenlight a game like The Last Guardian. It is a shame. Ranking this trilogy is almost pointless to me because they're all masterpieces to me. They are all pieces of art that give me goosebumps and stay in my head for days after beating them. I think Ego is still my favorite because I love how few mechanics there are, and I love the ambiguity of the whole story and especially the ending. Ego is such a small game that it has far fewer areas to mess up or annoy the player. Shadow of the Colossus probably just barely stays in second place because again, the feeling of killing giant monsters is so much fun, and I love how vast and empty most of the world is. The Last Guardian would probably be at third, simply because the last third of the game has some slightly frustrating moments, and this game is also by far the most clear of the trilogy. The story gives you way more answers than the other two games, and while I think that works, especially for a game that I said feels like a Ghibli movie, I think Team Ico was at their best when they shrouded themselves in mystery. I will never ever forget watching the last cutscene in Shadow of the Colossus and just going, what the fuck just happened? Reading up the theories for hours was just so much fun. You don't really have to do that with The Last Guardian. Almost everything is pretty clear here. The last point I want to make is, I went to check my trophies for the game. So one thing I noticed while I was checking my trophies after finishing this game is, so this is when I originally beat it, right? And this is just the trophy for beating the game. That's it. Only 20% of the people who bought this game beat it. And then there's like other trophies that I got that weren't even that hard, like feeding Trico a barrel by throwing it at him. 1%, 1.7% of people got that trophy. It's like nobody played this, and it's a shame. And obviously, this game is a PlayStation exclusive. This is the only place to play it. So only 1/5 of the people who got this game decided to finish it. And that really sucks. That really, really sucks. I really feel like The Last Guardian deserved way better. And that's my answer right there. That's why Sony isn't doing these types of artsy, non-mainstream games anymore. It's the reason why they shut down Japan Studio, which I feel like was a massive mistake. It's why I feel so alone, preferring an experience like this to most other games. I get it, visceral games where you're just killing and exploring and collecting shit is super fun and like a dopamine rush. But damn, like, only 20% of people? Like, and maybe it's that loneliness. Maybe that's why the isolation of a Team Ego game really speaks to my soul. Thank you so much for watching my video. Have a great day.